In 2010, a Russian archaeologist named Alexander Tsibankov was digging through layers of ancient sediment in a cave high in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. Cold, remote, barely accessible. The kind of place where you wouldn't expect to find anything that would rewrite human history. He pulled out a fragment of bone, small, dirty, unremarkable. Just a piece of a finger from someone who died tens of thousands of years ago. Nobody could have guessed that this tiny bone fragment would reveal the existence of an entire human species that science didn't know existed. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos, so subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check the comments and it's wild. Tokyo at sunrise, London at lunch, Los Angeles at lights out all at once. That bone fragment, when analysed, contained DNA that didn't match any known human species. Not Homo sapiens, not Neanderthals, something else entirely. Scientists name them Denisovans, after the cave where they were found. And here's what keeps researchers awake at night. We know almost nothing about them. No complete skeleton. No clear pictures of what they looked like. No cave paintings or burial sites that tell us about their culture. Just fragments, DNA, traces, echoes of a lost people who vanished from the earth without leaving a clear record of their existence. But here's the thing that makes this story even more haunting. They didn't completely disappear. Parts of them are still here, inside us. Between 3 and 6% of the DNA in modern Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians comes from Denisovans. Tibetans carry Denisovan genes that help them survive at high altitudes. People across Asia and Oceania are walking around with genetic gifts from a mysterious species that went extinct at least 30,000 years ago. Today, we're the only human species left on Earth. Just us, Homo sapiens, alone. But for most of human history, we weren't alone. Earth was home to multiple human species living at the same time. Neanderthals in Europe and the Middle East, Homo erectus in Asia, Homo floresiensis, the hobbits on Indonesian islands, and the Denisovans scattered across Asia, surviving in some of the harshest environments on the planet. They all vanished, every single one, except us. Tonight, we're going on a journey back through time to meet the most mysterious of all these lost human species, the Denisovans. We'll walk through their world, explore how they lived, and try to understand how they encountered and interbred with our own ancestors. We'll look at the fragments of evidence, the DNA sequences, the archaeological mysteries that have scientists racing to caves across Asia, searching for answers. Who were the Denisovans? What did they look like? How did they survive in frozen Siberian caves and tropical Southeast Asian islands? Why did they disappear when we survived? And most intriguing of all, what does it mean that we still carry pieces of them inside our own DNA? These are questions without complete answers. The Denisovans remain ghosts in our genetic code, a species known more from absence than presence. But every year scientists uncover new clues. A jawbone in Tibet, genetic traces in cave sediments, ancient proteins that reveal unexpected connections. The story of the Denisovans is the story of a species that vanished without a trace, leaving only whispers in our DNA and fragments in frozen caves. It's a mystery that reminds us how strange and uncertain our own origins really are. Let's begin. 'Cause here's the thing about lost human species. We can theorize about them all we want, construct elaborate evolutionary trees, argue about ancient DNA and population genetics. But until you find physical evidence, until you hold actual bone in your hand, it's all just educated guessing. And sometimes The most important discoveries in human history come from the smallest, most unassuming fragments imaginable. March 2008. Denisova Cave, nestled in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia. If you've never been to this part of the world, picture this. Vast mountain ranges stretching to the horizon, dense pine forests, rivers cutting through valleys that have existed for millions of years. The cave itself sits about 700 meters above sea level, looking out over the Anhui River Valley. It's not a dramatic entrance, not some massive cathedral-like cavern, just a modest opening in the limestone, the kind of place you might walk past without a second glance. But archaeologists had been working this cave for decades. Since the 1970s, Soviet and Russian teams had been carefully excavating layer after layer of sediment, finding stone tools, animal bones, evidence of human occupation going back thousands of years. It was a good site, productive, full of information about how ancient people lived in this harsh environment. But nothing particularly groundbreaking. Nothing that would make international headlines. Then, in one of the deeper layers, dating to around 50,000 years ago, a researcher found something. A fragment of bone. A piece of a pinky finger, to be precise. The entire fragment was smaller than a pebble, weighing just a fraction of an ounce, dark brown from age, partially mineralized, unremarkable to look at. In most archaeological excavations, this would have been catalogued, stored, maybe studied briefly, then filed away. Just another human bone fragment from just another archaeological site, except the researchers at Denisova Cave had started doing something different. They were sending bone samples to the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany. To a lab run by a Swedish geneticist named Svante Pääbo, a man who had been pioneering techniques for extracting and analysing ancient DNA. DNA that had been sitting in bones for tens of thousands of years, slowly degrading, breaking down into smaller and smaller fragments. Most scientists thought ancient DNA recovery was impossible, that genetic material couldn't survive more than a few thousand years. But Pääbo had been proving them wrong, developing methods to extract, amplify and sequence DNA from Neanderthal bones. And now he was about to do something nobody expected. The finger bone fragment arrived in Leipzig. Standard procedure was to extract DNA and sequence it, expecting it would match either modern humans or Neanderthals. Both species were known to have lived in Siberia during the Ice Age, so this bone had to belong to one of them. It had to. Except when the DNA results came back, they didn't match. Not modern human, not Neanderthal. Something else entirely. At first, the team thought it was contamination. Ancient DNA work is incredibly delicate. A single molecule of modern DNA can contaminate a sample, producing false results. So, they ran the analysis again. Different extraction methods, different sequencing techniques, multiple verification protocols. Every time, the same result. This DNA was human, definitely human, but it was divergent from both known human species. It showed genetic patterns that suggested it had split from the common ancestor of modern humans and Neanderthals around 800,000 years ago, right around the time of that genetic bottleneck we talked about earlier. They had found a third species, an entirely unknown branch of the human family tree, a ghost population that had been living alongside modern humans and Neanderthals for hundreds of thousands of years, and nobody had known they existed. Now, imagine being on that research team. You're looking at DNA sequences on a computer screen, and you realize you're seeing genetic code from a species of human that walked the Earth 50,000 years ago, a species that nobody knew existed. A species that has been extinct for millennia, but whose genetic signature is right there in front of you, clear as day. It's like finding a completely new colour that nobody has ever seen before. Your brain struggles to process what you're looking at because it challenges everything you thought you knew. The scientific verification process that followed was intense. Pabo's team is cautious, methodical. They had to be. Announcing a new human species based on a single finger bone fragment would subject them to massive scrutiny. Other researchers would assume error, contamination, misinterpretation, so they sequenced the DNA multiple times from different parts of the bone. They compared it against every known human genome in their database. They ran statistical analyses to calculate the probability of error. They checked and rechecked until they were absolutely certain. Meanwhile, back in Denisova Cave, archaeologists started looking more carefully at other bone fragments that had been recovered over the years. Thousands of bones had been excavated from the cave, most of them from animals: cave bears, woolly, mammoths, ancient horses, reindeer. But scattered among them were a few fragments that might have been human, too fragmentary or damaged to identify definitively. Now, those fragments took on new significance. They found teeth. 2 molars, massive things, larger than any modern human teeth, larger even than Neanderthal teeth. One was an adult tooth, the other from a juvenile. Both showed unique characteristics, not quite like anything seen in other human species. The cusps were arranged differently, the roots were unusually large, the overall morphology was distinct. Then, in 2015, another team member found a skull fragment. Just a piece of cranium, but enough to show that whoever these people were, they had robust bone structure, thick skulls adapted for a harsh environment. That's it. That's the entire fossil record. 1 finger bone fragment, 2 teeth, a few skull pieces, and some additional bone fragments that might or might not belong to the same species. If you gathered every physical fossil of Denisovans ever found, you could hold them all in one hand. From these tiny fragments, scientists were trying to reconstruct an entire species, understand their place in human evolution, figure out how they lived, where they went, why they disappeared. But here's where it gets really wild. The cold Siberian climate that made life so difficult for ancient humans turned out to be perfect for preserving DNA. Temperatures in Denisova Cave remain cold year-round, just above freezing. This slowed the degradation of genetic material dramatically. While DNA from bones in warmer climates breaks down within a few thousand years, becoming too fragmented to analyze, DNA in these Siberian fossils remained intact enough to sequence even after 50,000 years. This preservation was so good that Pabo's team was able to extract not just fragments of DNA, but entire genomes. They could sequence every chromosome, identify individual genes, even determine which variants of those genes these ancient humans carried. They could literally read the genetic instruction manual that had built these people, cell by cell, generation by generation. It was an unprecedented window into ancient human biology, and that genetic data revealed something shocking. The DNA wasn't just different from modern humans and Neanderthals. It showed evidence of that ancient bottleneck we discussed earlier. The same chromosomal fusion, the same reduced genetic diversity. These people were descendants of the same 1,280 survivors who had made it through 117,000 years of near extinction. They were our cousins, separated by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, but still fundamentally connected. In December 2010, the team published their findings in Nature, one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals. The paper was titled Genetic History of an Archaic Hominin Group from Denisova Cave in Siberia. Understated, technical, the kind of dry academic language that scientists use. But the implications were explosive. They had discovered a new human species using only DNA, without traditional fossil evidence like complete skulls or skeletons. They had proved that human evolution was far more complex than anyone had imagined, with multiple species coexisting, probably interacting, maybe even competing for resources. The scientific community was stunned. Some researchers were skeptical at first. How could you identify an entire species from a finger bone? What if it was just an unusual individual, a genetic outlier? But as more researchers analyzed the data, ran their own comparisons, examined the statistical evidence, the conclusion became undeniable. This was real. This was a distinct human lineage that had existed alongside our ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years. They needed a name. In scientific tradition, new species are usually named after the place where they're discovered. So these people became Homo sapiens denisova, later shortened to Denisovans, named after Denis, a Russian hermit who had supposedly lived in the cave in the 18th century. It's a strange legacy, an entire human species named after a religious hermit who probably never knew that ancient people had lived in the same cave thousands of years before him. But finding the fossils and sequencing the DNA was just the beginning. Now came the really hard part, figuring out who these people actually were. Where had they come from? Where had they lived? How had they survived in the harsh Siberian environment? And most importantly, what had happened to them? Because whatever their story was, it ended in extinction. The Denisovans were gone, vanished completely, leaving behind only a handful of bone fragments and the genetic echoes in modern human populations. The cave itself became a kind of time capsule. Archaeologists began re-examining every layer of sediment, every artifact, every bone fragment with new eyes. The cave had been occupied repeatedly over hundreds of thousands of years. Different human groups had lived there at different times, sometimes overlapping. The deepest layers, going back more than 280,000 years, showed evidence of very early human activity. Middle layers contained Neanderthal fossils and tools. Upper layers had modern human remains and more sophisticated stone tools. And scattered through multiple layers were these Denisovan fragments, suggesting they had used the cave repeatedly across vast stretches of time. What emerged was a picture of Denisova Cave as a crossroads, a meeting place where three different human species had lived at various points, maybe even at the same time. The cave sits in a valley that connects the Siberian plains to the north, with the mountain passes leading south into Central Asia. It would have been a natural corridor for migrating animals and the humans who hunted them, a place where different groups might encounter each other, trade, compete, or even interbreed. Because the DNA told one more crucial story. The Denisovan genome showed evidence of interbreeding with both Neanderthals and modern humans, genetic sequences that could only have come from mixing between species. This meant these groups weren't completely isolated. When their ranges overlapped, when they encountered each other in places like this Siberian valley, they didn't just fight. They also formed relationships, had children together, created family lines that carried DNA from multiple human species. We are all products of these ancient encounters, all carrying genetic heritage from species that no longer exist. And it all started with one tiny finger bone, smaller than a pebble, found in a cave in Siberia. Sometimes the most important discoveries come in the smallest packages, and sometimes understanding where we came from requires us to look at fragments of the past and imagine the whole. But who exactly were these mysterious Denisovans? What did they look like? How did they live? That's where the story gets even more fascinating. Here's the really wild part about the Denisovans. We know they existed. We know they were widespread. We know they interbred with our ancestors, but we have almost no idea what they actually looked like. Think about that for a second. We have exactly one nearly complete fossil, a tiny fragment of finger bone found in a Siberian cave. That's it. That's what we're working with. One pinky bone from a teenage girl who died about 50,000 years ago. Oh, and a few teeth. 3 molars to be precise. And a jawbone discovered in Tibet. That's the entire physical evidence we have for an entire human species that ranged across half of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. But here's where modern science gets absolutely mind-blowing. From that finger bone, from those teeth, from that jawbone, and most importantly from the DNA extracted from them, geneticists have managed to reconstruct an entire species. Not just that they existed, but who they were, where they lived, how they adapted, and even, through some incredibly sophisticated analysis, hints about what they might have looked like. Let's start with what the DNA tells us. When researchers at the Max Planck Institute first sequenced the genome from that finger bone, they expected to find either a Neanderthal or an early modern human. What they found instead was something completely unexpected, a genetic signature that was different from both. Different enough that they were looking at an entirely distinct human species. The genetic divergence showed that Denisovans had split from Neanderthals roughly 400,000 years ago. To put that in perspective, modern humans and Neanderthals split from a common ancestor maybe 600,000 years ago. So Denisovans were our cousins, but slightly more distant cousins than Neanderthals were. But the really fascinating part comes when geneticists started looking at what makes Denisovan DNA different. Not just different in a random mutation kind of way, but different in ways that tell us about physical traits. There's a technique now, relatively new, called DNA methylation analysis. Basically, it looks at how genes are turned on or off, which can tell you about body structure, facial features, even skin and hair color. Using this technique on the Denisovan genome, researchers have been able to create what amounts to a genetic police sketch. And what emerges is both familiar and alien. Denisovans were big. Probably bigger than modern humans, possibly bigger than Neanderthals. The few bones we have suggest robust builds, heavy bone structure, massive teeth. Those 3 molars found in Denisova Cave, they're huge, larger than Neanderthal molars, which are already larger than ours. We're talking teeth that would look comically oversized in a modern human mouth. The jawbone found in Tibet, the Syahi mandible as it's called, tells a similar story. It's massive, heavily built, with a pronounced chinlessness that reminds us these were not modern humans. The muscle attachment points suggest enormously powerful jaw muscles. These were people who could process tough foods that would leave us with sore jaws for days. But size isn't everything. The really interesting stuff is in the adaptations, because the Denisovans weren't just living in one place. They were spread across an absolutely enormous geographic range. From the Altai Mountains of Siberia, where that finger bone was found, all the way to Southeast Asia, down into Indonesia, across to the Philippines, and up to the high-altitude Tibetan plateau. That's not just impressive, that's unprecedented. We're talking about a range that includes some of the most extreme and varied environments on Earth. Arctic conditions in Siberia, tropical rainforests in Indonesia, the oxygen-starved heights of the Himalayan plateau. And here's what's incredible. They didn't just survive in these places, they thrived. They adapted so completely that their genetic innovations are still helping modern humans live in these environments today. Let's talk about that Tibetan jawbone for a minute, because it's one of the most important Denisovan fossils we have. Found in Baishia Karst Cave at 3,280 meters above sea level, this jawbone sat in a cave for 160,000 years. 160,000 years. That makes it the oldest Denisovan fossil we have, and proof that they were living at high altitudes far earlier than anyone imagined possible. Living at that altitude isn't easy. The air is thin. There's about 40% less oxygen than at sea level. Most people who try to live at those heights without proper acclimatization suffer from chronic mountain sickness, headaches, fatigue, difficulty breathing, eventually organ damage. But the Denisovans figured it out. And we know how they did it because the genetic solution they developed is still present in modern Tibetan populations. It's a gene variant called EPAS1, sometimes called the superathlete gene because it helps the body use oxygen more efficiently. Modern Tibetans have this gene. Genetic analysis shows they got it from Denisovans through interbreeding thousands of years ago. It's one of the clearest examples we have of ancient humans passing on a crucial survival adaptation to modern populations. But altitude adaptation was just one of their tricks. Genetic analysis of modern populations across Asia and Oceania shows multiple Denisovan gene variants that helped with all kinds of environmental challenges, immune system genes that protected against local diseases, metabolic genes that helped process different types of foods, even genes that affected skin pigmentation and body fat distribution. The picture that emerges is of a human species that was incredibly adaptable, not through culture and technology alone, though they had that too, but through rapid biological adaptation. They were evolution in action, constantly adjusting to new environments, developing new genetic solutions to survival challenges. Now, you might be wondering about their brains, their intelligence, their capacity for culture. Did they think like us? Did they have language, art, symbolic reasoning? Here's where things get frustrating because we have so little archaeological evidence. But what we do have is suggestive, very suggestive. In Denisova Cave, where that finger bone was found, archaeologists have discovered sophisticated stone tools, jewelry made from animal bones and teeth, even a bone needle suggesting they made tailored clothing. The cave shows evidence of controlled fire use, organized living spaces, systematic processing of animal remains. This isn't primitive behavior. This is sophisticated cultural activity that requires planning, skill transmission across generations, probably language. More tantalizing are hints that Denisovans might have been the first human species to develop maritime technology. There's evidence they reached islands in Southeast Asia that would have required open water crossings, the Philippines, for instance. To get there from mainland Asia requires crossing stretches of ocean that would have been at least 40 miles wide even during the ice ages when sea levels were lower. That means boats, not just rafts or logs to cling to, but actual boats capable of carrying people across open ocean. That requires sophisticated knowledge of materials, construction techniques, navigation. It requires the ability to teach these skills to others, to maintain knowledge across generations. We have no direct evidence of Denisovan boats, of course. Wood doesn't preserve for 50,000 years. But the presence of Denisovan DNA in modern populations on these islands tells us they got there somehow, and the most plausible explanation is that they built boats. Now, let's talk about how Denisovans compared to their cousins, the Neanderthals and modern humans. Genetically, they were closer to Neanderthals than to us. The split between Denisovans and Neanderthals happened about 400,000 years ago, while the split between these two groups and modern humans happened around 600,000 years ago. But despite being closer to Neanderthals, Denisovans seem to have been more geographically expansive. Neanderthals were successful, no doubt about it, but they were primarily a European and Western Asian species. Denisovans range much farther, adapting to a much wider variety of environments. In terms of physical characteristics, Denisovans seem to have been more robust than modern humans, but possibly less specialized for cold environments than Neanderthals. Those big teeth and powerful jaws suggest they might have been processing tougher foods than either of their cousin species. Brain-wise, we can only make educated guesses. The skull fragments we have suggest cranial capacities in the same range as Neanderthals, possibly slightly larger than modern humans. But brain size isn't everything. It's organization and connectivity that matter for intelligence. What we can say is that Denisovans were clearly capable of sophisticated behavior. They made complex tools, adapted to extreme environments, possibly developed maritime technology, and successfully competed with other human species for hundreds of thousands of years. That requires significant cognitive abilities. Population-wise, genetic diversity in the Denisovan genome tells an interesting story. The original finger bone shows surprisingly high genetic diversity, much higher than modern humans but similar to what we see in Neanderthals. This suggests Denisovan populations were reasonably large, at least in some regions and time periods. But here's where it gets complicated. Further genetic analysis shows evidence of at least 3 distinct Denisovan populations that were separated long enough to develop significant genetic differences. There were Siberian Denisovans, Southeast Asian Denisovans, and what some researchers call a third mystery population, whose genetic signature shows up in some modern populations but doesn't match either of the other two groups. This tells us that Denisovans, like Neanderthals and modern humans, weren't one monolithic species spread uniformly across their range. They were multiple populations, separated by geography, probably by culture, evolving semi-independently, but occasionally coming back into contact and interbreeding. Think of them as a network of related populations rather than a single unified group. Some populations probably never encountered others. A Denisovan group in Siberia might have lived their entire existence without ever meeting their cousins in Southeast Asia. Yet they were all still Denisovans, all still carrying that fundamental genetic signature that mark them as distinct from both Neanderthals and modern humans, all still possessing those remarkable adaptive capabilities that let them thrive in environments from Arctic tundra to tropical islands. And here's the truly remarkable thing. For hundreds of thousands of years, these people lived, loved, raised children, developed technologies, told stories we'll never hear, and solved problems we can barely imagine. They were fully human in every way that matters, just a different branch of humanity than the one that eventually survived. They had fears and hopes. They cared for their sick and buried their dead. They looked up at the stars and wondered what they were seeing. They felt joy and pain and everything in between, and then they vanished. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, over thousands of years, their populations dwindled until one day, somewhere, the last Denisovan died and an entire branch of humanity ended. But not completely, because they left us something. They left their genes scattered through modern populations like messages in bottles, washing up on the shores of our genome. They left us high-altitude adaptations and immune system variants and metabolic innovations that are still helping people survive in challenging environments today. They left us the mystery of who they were and where they went, and that mystery, frustrating as it is, reminds us of something important. The story of humanity is bigger, stranger, and more complex than we ever imagined. We are not now, and never have been, the only humans, just the ones who happen to survive. Now here's where things get really interesting, because we're not just talking about DNA sequences and genetic markers anymore. We're talking about actual people. Real humans who woke up every morning in a world we can barely imagine, who faced challenges we've never encountered, who solved problems we'll never have to solve. So what was life actually like for the Denisovans? Start with where they lived. The Denisova cave in Siberia wasn't just a random shelter, it was a carefully chosen home. The cave sits at an altitude of about 2,300 feet, positioned perfectly to overlook the Anui River Valley. From the entrance, you could see for miles, watch for approaching animals, spot potential threats, monitor the movement of herds. Archaeological excavations have revealed that Denisovans occupied this cave not for years or decades, but for hundreds of thousands of years, layer after layer of sediment, each containing evidence of human activity. Stone tools, animal bones, charcoal from fires. This wasn't a temporary camp, this was home. The cave itself provided ideal living conditions for the Ice Age. Natural insulation from the brutal Siberian winters, protection from the wind and snow, multiple chambers where different activities could take place, cooking in one area, toolmaking in another, sleeping spaces in the back where it stayed warmest. But here's what really tells us about their intelligence. They managed fire with incredible sophistication, not just keeping fires burning, but controlling them. Archaeological evidence shows carefully constructed hearths, positioned to maximize heat distribution while minimizing smoke. They understood ventilation, knew how to arrange stones to radiate heat long after the flames died down. This is advanced environmental engineering. It requires understanding cause and effect, the ability to plan and modify your environment systematically. It's the kind of thinking that separates humans from animals. And the Denisovans weren't just living in caves. Genetic evidence suggests they spread across an enormous range of environments, from the Siberian mountains to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia. Each environment would have required different survival strategies, different shelters, different technologies. In high-altitude regions, they developed genetic adaptations to process oxygen efficiently, but they also needed behavioral adaptations, building windbreaks, creating insulated clothing from animal skins, understanding which plants could survive at elevation and which animals migrated through at different seasons. Groups that reached Southeast Asian islands would have needed entirely different skills: boat building, navigation, understanding tides and currents, the ability to carry fire across water or create it from scratch on new islands. This tells us something profound. The Denisovans weren't just adapted to one environment, they were adaptable, period. They could look at any landscape and figure out how to survive there. Now let's talk about their tools, because this is where the archaeological evidence gets really exciting. The stone tools found in Denisova Cave show a level of sophistication that would have impressed any Ice Age human. We're not talking about simple hand axes here. We're talking about carefully crafted implements designed for specific purposes, scrapers with precisely angled edges for processing animal hides, cutting tools with hafted handles, attached using plant resins and animal sinew. Projectile points designed to be launched from spears, or possibly even primitive atlatls, spear throwers that multiplied the force of a human arm. But the real showstopper, the artifact that made archaeologists completely reassess Denisovan cognitive abilities, was discovered in 2008. A polished green stone bracelet. Now, jewellery might not sound impressive, but this wasn't just decoration. This was a technological marvel. The bracelet was made from chlorite, a stone that's difficult to work. It had been carefully shaped, drilled with a hole using some kind of boring tool, then polished to a smooth finish. The level of craftsmanship rivals anything produced by modern humans of the same period. To create this bracelet required planning, specialized tools, and hours of patient work. You don't make something like this because you need to. You make it because you want to, because you understand abstract concepts like beauty and status. This is symbolic thinking at its finest. The bracelet served no practical survival purpose. It existed purely as a symbol, probably of status or group membership. It tells us Denisovans had developed the cognitive capacity for art, for creating objects that held meaning beyond their physical properties. They were thinking symbolically, abstractly, exactly like modern humans. The food evidence is equally fascinating. Animal bones excavated from Denisova Cave tell a story of sophisticated hunting strategies. Not just opportunistic scavenging, but systematic predation. They hunted everything from massive woolly mammoths to smaller game like horses and bison. The bone assemblages show evidence of selective butchery, taking the most nutritious parts, processing hides for leather, extracting marrow for its high-fat content. But they weren't just hunters. Plant remains suggest they gathered systematically, collecting nuts, berries, and edible roots. Some evidence suggests they might have processed plant foods to make them more digestible, grinding seeds or cooking tubers to break down tough fibers. This is what anthropologists call a broad-spectrum diet, not specializing in one food source, but exploiting everything the environment offered. It's a sign of intelligence, flexibility, the ability to adapt to changing conditions. When mammoth herds moved away, they switched to smaller game. When plant foods were scarce in winter, they relied more heavily on stored meat and processed marrow. When both were scarce, they probably caught fish from the river and trapped small mammals. This dietary flexibility is one reason they survived for so long. They weren't dependent on any single resource. If one food source failed, they had alternatives. The social structure is harder to reconstruct, but we can make some educated guesses based on genetic evidence and archaeological patterns. First, they lived in small groups, probably extended family units of maybe 20 to 40 individuals, large enough to defend territory and share labor, small enough that everyone could know everyone else personally. The genetic evidence shows something interesting, though. Low genetic diversity within groups, but significant differences between groups. This suggests they practiced exogamy, marrying outside their immediate family group. Young women or men would leave their birth group to join another, creating kinship networks between distant communities. This is sophisticated social organization. It requires understanding abstract kinship relationships, the ability to maintain alliances with groups you might not see for months or years. It's the kind of social complexity that requires language, planning, and long-term thinking. The cave occupation patterns suggest possible seasonal movements. Heavy occupation during brutal winter months when the cave's shelter was essential. Lighter occupation during summers when groups might have spread out to exploit seasonal resources. But even when groups dispersed, they maintained connections. The similar tool technologies found across vast distances suggest knowledge sharing. The genetic evidence of interbreeding shows they were meeting, communicating, forming relationships across enormous geographical ranges. They had created what anthropologists call a cultural network, not just individual groups surviving in isolation, but an interconnected web of communities sharing information, technologies, and genes. Now, living through the Ice Age required more than just good tools and clever hunting strategies. It required understanding your environment at a deep, almost intuitive level. The Denisovans mastered this. They learned to read weather patterns, predict seasonal changes, understand animal behavior. They knew which caves would flood during spring thaw and which would stay dry. They understood where animals would migrate and when. They could look at the sky and predict whether tomorrow would bring clear weather or deadly storms. This knowledge was cumulative, passed down through generations. Children learned from parents who learned from grandparents, each generation adding their own observations to a growing body of environmental knowledge. The genetic adaptations we discussed earlier, the high-altitude variants, the improved oxygen processing, these didn't develop in isolation. They evolved alongside behavioral adaptations. The Denisovans weren't just genetically equipped for harsh environments. They had cultural knowledge about how to survive there. High-altitude populations knew which plants could treat altitude sickness. They understood that you needed to ascend gradually, give your body time to adapt. They probably had strategies for keeping warm and preventing frostbite that we've lost. And they were creating art. Not just a bracelet, but possibly cave paintings, carved figures, decorative objects that haven't survived or haven't been found yet. The cognitive capacity required to create symbolic art is the same capacity needed for complex language, abstract reasoning, planning for the distant future. If Denisovans could make jewelry, they could tell stories. If they could tell stories, they could share knowledge across generations in ways that transcended direct experience. Imagine sitting around a fire in Denisova Cave 50,000 years ago. Outside, winter storms howl through the Siberian mountains. Inside, it's warm, the fire carefully maintained, smoke drifting up toward natural vents in the cave ceiling. Children are learning to chip stone, their small hands guided by experienced adults. Someone is scraping a hide, preparing leather for winter clothing. Others are processing food, maybe grinding plant materials or cutting meat into strips for drying. And someone is talking, sharing stories about successful hunts, teaching younger members about distant territories, passing on knowledge about which plants are edible and which are poisonous, warning about dangers and describing opportunities. This is humanity. Not modern human specifically, but human in the deepest sense. People caring for each other, teaching their children, planning for the future, creating beauty alongside utility. The Denisovans weren't primitive. They weren't evolutionary dead ends. They were sophisticated, intelligent, fully human in every way that matters. They just weren't us. They were their own species, following their own evolutionary path, developing their own solutions to the challenges of Ice Age survival. And for hundreds of thousands of years, those solutions worked perfectly. They thrived in environments that would kill modern humans without advanced technology. They spread across a third of the world. They developed technologies and survival strategies that were so effective, their genetic legacy still helps modern populations survive in extreme environments. But their success was about to be tested in ways they couldn't have anticipated, because another human species was expanding out of Africa. And when modern humans and Denisovans finally met, everything would change. Picture this. Somewhere in southern Siberia, About 90,000 years ago, a woman walks through a limestone cave. She's a Neanderthal with the characteristic robust build and prominent brow ridge that mark her species. She's lived in this region all her life, hunting mammoth and reindeer through the long Siberian winters. She knows every valley, every mountain pass, every place where edible plants grow during the brief summers. And somewhere in these mountains, she meets a man unlike anyone she's known before. He's taller than the Neanderthals she's grown up with, more graceful, but clearly human. He speaks differently, but they can communicate. The genetic evidence suggests they could do more than communicate. They formed a partnership. Maybe it was love, maybe it was political alliance between two groups, maybe it was just two lonely people finding companionship in a harsh landscape. We'll never know the emotional details, but we know what happened next. They had a daughter, and 90,000 years later, scientists would find her bones and call her Denny. She would become the most important fossil in the study of human interbreeding. Because here's what makes Denny extraordinary. Her mother was Neanderthal. Her father was Denisovan. She was a first-generation hybrid between two distinct human species. The direct, undeniable proof that different human species didn't just coexist. They formed intimate relationships. They built families together. Think about what that means. For this interbreeding to happen, these species had to recognize each other as fundamentally human. They had to be able to communicate well enough to form relationships. They had to find each other attractive enough to become intimate partners, and most importantly, their offspring had to be viable, healthy enough to survive to adulthood. Because Denny wasn't a baby when she died. She was at least 13, possibly older. She lived for years as a hybrid between two species. Her body carried genes from both parents, a unique combination of Neanderthal and Denisovan traits that had never existed before and would never exist again. But she wasn't alone. The genetic evidence shows that interbreeding between human species wasn't some rare accident. It happened repeatedly, across thousands of years, in multiple locations around the world. Every time different human species encountered each other, at least some of them chose to form relationships across species lines. The cave where Denny's bones were found, Denisovan Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, is itself a testament to these encounters. Archaeological excavations have revealed something remarkable. This single cave was occupied by all three major human species at different times over a period of more than 300,000 years. Denisovans lived there first, leaving behind stone tools and bone fragments dating back perhaps 300,000 years. They used the cave as a seasonal shelter, probably during harsh winters when the mountains became impassable. Then Neanderthals arrived, moving into the cave around 200,000 years ago. For tens of thousands of years, the two species apparently alternated occupancy. Sometimes Denisovans controlled the cave, sometimes Neanderthals. Sometimes, the evidence suggests, both groups were present at the same time. Different layers of the archaeological deposits show overlapping occupation. Tools from both species mixed together. Hearths that show evidence of both Neanderthal and Denisovan fire-making techniques. And finally, much later, modern humans arrived. Around 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens reached the Altai Mountains and began using Denisova Cave themselves. This cave was a crossroads of humanity, a place where three evolutionary paths converged, separated by hundreds of thousands of years of independent evolution, yet still capable of recognizing each other as kin. But the question that haunts researchers is, what were these encounters actually like? When a Neanderthal group met a band of Denisovans at the entrance to a cave, what happened next. The Romantic interpretation suggests peaceful coexistence. Groups meeting at territorial boundaries, trading goods, sharing information about resources and dangers, occasionally intermarrying to cement alliances between communities. There's some evidence for this. The genetic data shows that interbreeding produced viable, healthy offspring who survived to reproduce themselves. That suggests these weren't violent encounters resulting in rape and coercion, but consensual relationships between individuals who saw each other as potential partners. Moreover, the archaeological record shows evidence of cultural exchange, stone tool technologies that appear to spread from one species to another, ornamental objects that show similar artistic traditions across species lines, hunting strategies that seem to be shared between Neanderthal and Denisovan populations. But there's a darker possibility too. The frequency of interbreeding was actually quite low. Most Neanderthal DNA and most Denisovan DNA shows no sign of mixing with other species, which means that while interbreeding did happen, it was relatively rare. Maybe most encounters were hostile, different human species competing for the same caves, the same hunting grounds, the same resources. Groups actively avoiding each other, maintaining territorial boundaries through threats and occasional violence. Interbreeding might have happened primarily in border zones, places where territories overlapped and small groups of individuals from different species occasionally encountered each other away from their main populations. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Some encounters peaceful, others violent. Some resulting in lasting alliances, others in conflict and displacement. Just like human societies today, ancient human species probably had complex, varied relationships with their neighbours. But here's what the genetic evidence tells us for certain. When interbreeding happened, it was successful. The hybrid offspring survived. They were healthy enough to have children of their own, and those children carried genes from both parent species, genes that spread through subsequent populations, genes that many of us still carry today. Modern humans outside Africa have between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. People of Asian and Oceanian descent have additional Denisovan DNA, sometimes as much as 5% in populations like the Melanesians. Some individuals even show evidence of multiple interbreeding events in their ancestry. Neanderthal genes from one ancestor, Denisovan genes from another, creating a genetic mosaic that represents thousands of years of intermittent contact between species. The geographic distribution of these genes tells us where the encounters probably occurred. Neanderthal DNA in modern humans suggests interbreeding happened in the Middle East, probably around 60,000 years ago, when the first modern humans left Africa and encountered Neanderthals who'd been living in the region for hundreds of thousands of years. Denisovan DNA appears in Asian populations, suggesting encounters happened as modern humans spread eastward across Asia. The highest levels of Denisovan ancestry appear in islands Southeast Asia and Melanesia, indicating that Denisovans had successfully colonized these regions and that modern humans encountered them there. Some researchers think there were multiple waves of Denisovan interbreeding, different Denisovan populations at different times contributing genes to modern human populations. The genetic evidence shows at least 2 distinct Denisovan lineages interbred with modern humans, and there might have been more that we haven't detected yet. But perhaps the most fascinating question is what these encounters were like on a personal level. When a Neanderthal woman looked at a Denisovan man, what did she see? Someone exotic but recognizably human. Someone whose language she could partially understand, whose gestures and expressions conveyed familiar emotions. or someone alien, different enough to be disturbing, yet similar enough to be intriguing? The capacity for these species to interbreed tells us they were remarkably similar biologically, similar enough that their reproductive systems were compatible, similar enough that the complex developmental processes that build a human body could incorporate genetic instructions from two different species and still produce a viable organism. That's actually quite rare in nature. Most species that are separated by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution can't successfully interbreed. And when they do, the offspring are usually sterile, like mules born from horses and donkeys. But human hybrids weren't sterile. They were fully functional members of their communities, capable of having children who were themselves healthy and fertile. This suggests that despite hundreds of thousands of years of separation, despite adapting to completely different environments and developing distinct physical characteristics, all human species shared a fundamental biological unity. The genetic bottleneck had created a common foundation that persisted even as populations diverged. We were all still human, all still carrying the chromosomal fusion that marked us as descendants of those 1,280 survivors, all still compatible at the most basic genetic level. The archaeological evidence hints at cultural exchange too. In sites where different human species overlapped, we sometimes find evidence of shared technologies. Neanderthals in regions where they encountered modern humans show more sophisticated tool-making techniques than Neanderthals in isolated populations. Modern humans in regions where they encountered Denisovans show evidence of cold weather adaptations that might have been learned from their cold-adapted neighbours. There are even suggestions that symbolic behaviour, things like art and ornament making, might have spread between species. Some of the earliest modern human art in Europe appears shortly after modern humans encountered Neanderthals, and it shows stylistic similarities to earlier Neanderthal symbolic objects. Did modern humans learn from Neanderthals? Did Neanderthals teach their modern human neighbours the survival skills that had kept them alive through Ice Age winters? Or was this independent invention, similar solutions to similar problems arising coincidentally? We can't know for certain, but the fact that genes crossed species boundaries suggests ideas probably did too. If individuals were forming relationships intimate enough to produce children, they were almost certainly sharing knowledge, teaching each other survival techniques, telling stories about their respective peoples. Deni's existence proves that these encounters could be peaceful, intimate, and productive. Her parents came from populations that had been separated for perhaps 400,000 years. They spoke different languages, came from different cultures, probably looked noticeably different from each other, yet somehow they connected. They formed a relationship stable enough to produce a child and raise her to adolescence. That speaks to something profound about human nature. Even across the boundaries of species, even separated by hundreds of thousands of years of independent evolution, humans recognized each other as kin. We were drawn to each other, curious about our distant cousins, willing to form connections that transcended biological and cultural differences. But these encounters were also temporary. As modern human populations grew and spread, the other human species began to disappear. Neanderthals vanished around 40,000 years ago. Denisovans probably disappeared around the same time, though some populations might have survived slightly longer in isolated regions. Were they outcompeted by modern humans, absorbed through interbreeding until they ceased to exist as distinct populations? Or did climate change and other environmental factors simply favour modern human adaptations over Neanderthal and Denisovan ones? Whatever the cause, the age of multiple human species was ending. The encounters that had defined human evolution for hundreds of thousands of years were coming to a close. Soon, only one human species would remain, but we would carry the genetic legacy of all three, living proof that for a brief moment in evolutionary history, multiple kinds of humans walked the earth together, met at cave entrances, formed relationships, and created children who bridged the gap between species. So here's where this story gets personal, because you might be thinking, this is all just ancient history, dusty bones in caves, academic debates about extinct species that have nothing to do with your life. But here's the thing, if you're watching this video, there's a decent chance you're carrying Denisovan DNA in your cells right now. Not a metaphor, not symbolic. Actual genetic sequences that were copied from Denisovan chromosomes into your ancestors' genomes tens of thousands of years ago, and they're still there, still functioning, still affecting how your body works today. Let me break down exactly what we're talking about. When scientists started analyzing the genomes of modern human populations around the world, they found something shocking. People from different regions carried different amounts of ancient human DNA. Europeans and Asians had Neanderthal DNA. That much they expected. But populations in Melanesia, the island chains northeast of Australia, they had something else. Something that didn't match the Neanderthal signature. That's when they realized these people were carrying Denisovan genes. Melanesians, populations in Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Vanuatu, and surrounding islands, they carry the highest percentage of Denisovan DNA of any living humans. We're talking about 4 to 6% of their total genome. Think about that. 1 out of every 20 genes in their DNA came from a completely different human species. Aboriginal Australians also carry significant Denisovan ancestry, typically around 4%, and various populations across Southeast Asia show Denisovan DNA percentages ranging from 1 to 3%. The Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia all show evidence of ancient interbreeding. But here's where it gets really wild. Tibetans, people living on the high plateau of Central Asia, they carry a specific piece of Denisovan DNA that's practically a miracle of evolutionary adaptation. It's a gene called EPAS1, and it does something that should be impossible. It lets humans live comfortably at altitudes where other people can barely breathe. Let me explain how incredible this is. When most humans try to live above 13,000 feet, their bodies struggle, the air is thin, oxygen levels are low. Your body responds by producing more red blood cells, trying to capture every bit of available oxygen. Sounds good, right? Except it's not. Too many red blood cells makes your blood thick, sluggish. It increases risk of blood clots, strokes, miscarriages in pregnant women. It's a survival mechanism that becomes dangerous over the long term. People who move to high altitudes from low altitude regions often develop serious health problems from this overproduction of red blood cells. But Tibetans don't have this problem. They can live at 14,000, 15,000, even 16,000 feet without their bodies going into this dangerous overproduction mode. Their blood remains at healthy red blood cell levels even in thin air. For years, scientists couldn't figure out why. Then they sequenced Tibetan genomes and found the answer. The EPAS1 gene, a variant that came directly from Denisovans. This gene regulates how the body responds to low oxygen. The Denisovan version tells the body to stay calm, don't overproduce red blood cells, work smarter, not harder. It's like having a built-in altitude adjustment that other humans lack. Here's what makes this so remarkable. Scientists estimate that this gene entered the modern human gene pool between 30,000 and 40,000 years ago. Some Denisovan population living in the high mountains of Central Asia met some group of modern humans. They interbred, and a few of those hybrid children inherited this altitude adaptation gene. Then, over thousands of years as modern humans spread across the Tibetan Plateau, natural selection went to work. People with the Denisovan gene variant could live and work at high altitudes more effectively. They had more surviving children. They passed on the gene more successfully. Today, 87% of Tibetans carry this Denisovan gene variant. In less than 40,000 years, which is nothing in evolutionary terms, a gene from an extinct species became nearly universal in an entire human population. That's natural selection in action. That's evolution happening fast enough that we can actually track it. But the altitude gene isn't the only Denisovan gift in our DNA. Immune system genes, these might be even more important. When modern humans left Africa and spread across the world, they encountered new environments with new pathogens, bacteria and viruses they had never been exposed to before. They had no immunity, no genetic defenses. But the Denisovans and Neanderthals, they'd been living in Asia and Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. They'd been exposed to every local disease, and natural selection had equipped them with immune system genes specifically adapted to fight these regional pathogens. When modern humans interbred with Denisovans, we didn't just get random DNA, we got an instant upgrade to our immune systems. Think of it like downloading an antivirus update, except instead of software, it's actual genetic code that helps your cells recognize and fight off infections. Scientists have identified several immune system genes that modern Asian and Oceanian populations inherited from Denisovans. These genes help regulate inflammatory responses. They help cells recognize viral infections faster. They improve the body's ability to fight off certain types of bacteria. Some of these genes show evidence of strong positive selection, meaning they spread rapidly through populations because they provided such significant survival advantages. There's also evidence that Denisovan DNA helped modern humans adapt to island environments. Populations in Southeast Asia and Oceania carry Denisovan gene variants related to fat metabolism and body temperature regulation. These might have helped their ancestors survive in tropical climates or adapt to diets heavy in marine resources. We're still figuring out exactly what all these genes do, but the pattern is clear. Denisovan DNA gave modern humans tools to survive in environments where we otherwise would have struggled. Now let's talk numbers, because the percentage of Denisovan DNA in modern populations tells a story about ancient human migration and interbreeding patterns. Most people of purely African descent carry 0 Denisovan DNA. Makes sense, right? Denisovans lived in Asia, and if your ancestors never left Africa, they never encountered Denisovans. People of purely European descent typically carry little to no Denisovan DNA, usually less than 0, 1% if any. Europeans have Neanderthal DNA, but their ancestors' migration routes apparently didn't overlap much with Denisovan territories. East Asians, populations in China, Japan, Korea, they typically carry around 0.2 to 0.4% Denisovan DNA. Still, relatively low, but clearly their ancestors had some contact with Denisovan populations. Then you get to Southeast Asia, and the percentages start climbing. Thai populations, Vietnamese, Filipino populations, they range from 1 to 3% Denisovan DNA. Aboriginal Australians, around 4%. And Melanesian populations the highest in the world at 4 to 6%. This tells us something important about how modern humans spread across the world. The ancestors of Melanesians must have taken a migration route that brought them into extensive contact with Denisovan populations. They didn't just meet once, They lived alongside each other, interbred repeatedly over thousands of years. Some scientists think there might have been entire hybrid populations, communities where Denisovans and modern humans lived and bred together for generations before one population was absorbed into the other. But here's where the story gets even stranger. When scientists look closely at the Denisovan DNA in different modern populations, they find something unexpected. It's not all from the same Denisovan population. The Denisovan DNA in Melanesians looks slightly different from the Denisovan DNA in East Asians, which looks different from the Denisovan DNA in the high-altitude gene in Tibetans. This suggests modern humans didn't just encounter one Denisovan population. We encountered multiple genetically distinct Denisovan groups spread across Asia and Oceania. Each group had been evolving separately for tens of thousands of years, developing their own unique genetic signatures. And then there's the ghost DNA. This is where things get really mysterious. When geneticists analyze the genomes of modern human populations, especially in Asia and Oceania, they find segments of DNA that don't match any known human species. Not modern human, not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, something else. These ghost lineages, as scientists call them, suggest there were other human species out there that we haven't discovered yet. Species that left no fossils we've found, no archaeological traces, nothing except a few fragments of DNA in modern human genomes, proof that we met them, interbred with them, and then they vanished. One of these ghost populations seems to have lived in Southeast Asia. Modern humans encountered them, interbred, and then they disappeared, leaving only genetic traces. Another possible ghost population lived in East Asia. Some researchers think there might have been 3 or 4 unknown human species that modern humans encountered and absorbed as we spread across the world. We're walking around with DNA from species we haven't even named yet, species we know existed only because their genes are still functioning in our bodies. What does all this mean for our understanding of human evolution? It completely changes the story we've been telling ourselves. For decades, the narrative was simple. Modern humans evolved in Africa, left around 60,000 years ago and spread across the world, replacing all other human species. Clean, simple, one species conquering the globe. But the genetic evidence tells a much more complicated story. Yes, modern humans spread across the world, but we didn't replace other human species so much as absorb them. We interbred with every human species we encountered. Neanderthals, Denisovans, probably several others we haven't identified yet. Every time we met another human species, at least some individuals on both sides chose to breed together, creating hybrid children who carried genes from both populations. Some of those hybrid children survived, reproduced, passed on their mixed heritage. Over thousands of years, the distinct human species merged genetically, creating the diverse populations we see today. We're not pure anything, we're all hybrids, all carrying pieces of multiple human species in our DNA. The story of human evolution isn't one of conquest and replacement, it's a story of mixing, merging, and mutual adaptation. We survived not by staying pure, but by borrowing the best survival traits from every human species we encountered. And here's the really personal part. You can actually find out if you carry Denisovan DNA yourself. Direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies now include ancient human ancestry in their reports. If you've done 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, or similar services, you can check your results to see if you have Neanderthal or Denisovan ancestry. If your ancestors came from East Asia, Southeast Asia, or Oceania, you almost certainly carry at least some Denisovan DNA. You can see exactly which chromosome segments came from ancient humans, sometimes even which specific genes. It's one thing to read about ancient history in a textbook. It's another thing entirely to see proof in your own genetic code that your ancestors lived alongside other human species, loved them, had children with them, and passed down their genes through hundreds of generations to you. Those Denisovan genes in your DNA, they're not just remnants of the past. They're functioning pieces of your biology, affecting how your body works right now. If you carry the EPAS1 gene, it's helping regulate your oxygen response. If you carry Denisovan immune system genes, they're helping your cells fight infections. These aren't fossils, they're living, working genes that have been continuously active for 40,000 years, helping every generation of your ancestors survive just a little bit better. We are not separate from the Denisovans. We are their continuation, their legacy, their immortality. They didn't vanish, they just became us, and then they were gone. Somewhere between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago, the Denisovans vanished. Not in a single catastrophic event, not all at once, but slowly, group by group, population by population, until finally there were none left. The species that had survived for hundreds of thousands of years, that had adapted to environments from tropical forests to frozen plateaus, that had interbred with modern humans and left their genetic signature in billions of people, simply disappeared from the archaeological record. The last known Denisovan site is Denisova Cave itself, dated to around 50,000 years ago. After that, nothing, no fossils, no artifacts we can definitively attribute to them, no clear evidence they were still around. It's like they walked into the shadows of history and never came back out. But here's what makes the disappearance so haunting. They didn't just vanish. They were erased so completely that we didn't even know they existed until 2010. Think about that. An entire human species successful enough to survive for hundreds of thousands of years, sophisticated enough to create complex tools and adapt to extreme environments, numerous enough to leave their DNA in modern populations from Siberia to Australia, and we had no idea they existed. Zero. Not a myth. Not a legend. Not even a whisper in the fossil record that couldn't be explained away as something else. So what happened? How does an entire human species disappear so thoroughly that it takes us 30,000 years and cutting-edge genetic analysis to even realize they existed? The short answer is we don't know for sure. But we have theories, each supported by different lines of evidence, each telling part of the story. And when you put them all together, what emerges is a picture not of a single catastrophe, but of multiple pressures converging at exactly the wrong time. A perfect storm of extinction that the Denisovans, despite all their adaptations and survival skills, simply couldn't weather. Let's start with the most obvious suspect: climate change. The period between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago was a time of dramatic environmental instability. This wasn't the gradual warming or cooling that species can adapt to over multiple generations. This was rapid, violent climate fluctuation. Temperatures could shift by 10 or 15 degrees Celsius within a single human lifetime. Entire ecosystems could transform from grassland to forest and back again within a few centuries. For a species like the Denisovans, who were already living in scattered, isolated populations across Asia, this kind of climate chaos would have been devastating. Remember, population genetics teaches us that small, isolated groups are incredibly vulnerable to environmental shocks. Put a few hundred individuals in a particular valley, then hit them with a drought or a sudden cold snap that kills off their food sources, and the entire population could go extinct. No backup, no rescue, just gone. And the climate during this period wasn't delivering single shocks, it was delivering them constantly, like a boxer working over an opponent who's already staggering. The ice sheets advanced and retreated multiple times. Sea levels rose and fell by over 100 meters, dramatically, altering coastlines and cutting off migration routes. Monsoon patterns shifted, turning reliable rainfall zones into deserts and vice versa. Each climate shift would have created winners and losers among Denisovan populations. Some groups in some locations would have thrived when conditions changed. Others would have struggled, and some would have died out completely. Over thousands of years, this process would have steadily whittled down the total Denisovan population, eliminating groups one by one until there weren't enough left to maintain a viable breeding network. But climate change alone probably wasn't enough to wipe them out. After all, the Denisovans had survived climate chaos before. They were the descendants of bottleneck survivors, remember? Their ancestors had made it through 117,000 years of near extinction. They knew how to handle difficult conditions. No, what made this period different was the arrival of competition. Specifically, competition from us, modern humans. Around 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began leaving Africa in significant numbers, and we didn't just trickle out. We exploded across the landscape, moving faster and spreading further than any previous human migration. Within 30,000 years, our ancestors had reached Australia, Europe, and the far corners of Asia. Every place they went, they encountered other human species, and everywhere they encountered other human species, those species eventually disappeared. This wasn't necessarily violent. We like to imagine dramatic confrontations, wars between human species, genocidal campaigns, and maybe some of that happened. But the evidence suggests most of the displacement was more subtle, more economic. Modern humans and Denisovans were competing for the same resources, the same hunting territories, the same water sources, the same caves and rock shelters, and in that competition, modern humans had advantages. We had more sophisticated tools. The period around 50,000 years ago marks the beginning of what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, an explosion of human technological innovation. Bow and arrow technology, throwing spears with atlatls that could kill from 100 meters away, nets for fishing, sewing needles that allowed creation of fitted clothing for cold climates. Modern humans were inventing new tools faster than Denisovans could adapt. We also had more complex social organization. The archaeological evidence suggests modern human groups were larger and more tightly organized than Denisovan populations. We formed alliances between multiple bands, created extensive trade networks, developed sophisticated systems for resolving conflicts within groups. This social complexity gave us a huge advantage in competition for resources. A modern human band of 50 people backed by alliances with 10 other bands would dominate any territory they moved into, pushing out smaller, more isolated Denisovan groups. Most importantly, we had language. Full, modern, syntactically complex language that allowed us to share detailed information, plan complex hunts, teach elaborate skills, and coordinate activities across large groups. If Denisovans had language, and they probably did to some degree, it likely wasn't as sophisticated as ours. That communication gap would have been a massive disadvantage in direct competition. So what happens when a slightly more advanced population moves into territory occupied by a slightly less advanced population? The historical record is pretty clear. The less advanced population gets pushed out, not violently, not all at once, but steadily, generation by generation. They get displaced to marginal territories. their population numbers decline, their breeding networks fragment, and eventually they go extinct. But there's another possibility, one that's actually supported by the genetic evidence. Maybe the Denisovans didn't go extinct at all. Maybe they were absorbed. We know modern humans and Denisovans interbred. The DNA evidence is unambiguous. Every time the two species encountered each other, at least some interbreeding occurred. And this wasn't rare. Genetic analysis suggests multiple episodes of interbreeding across thousands of years and thousands of miles. So picture this scenario. Modern human populations move into Denisovan territory. There's competition, sure, but also cooperation. Trading of goods, sharing of knowledge, and inevitably intermarriage. Over time, the distinct Denisovan populations become smaller as individuals join modern human groups. Maybe some Denisovan women marry into modern human bands. Maybe some modern human men join Denisovan groups. Each generation, the genetic and cultural boundaries get blurrier. After a few thousand years of this process, there might not be any pure Denisovans left. But there wouldn't need to be. Their genes would survive, incorporated into the expanding modern human population. Their knowledge and technologies would survive, adopted and adapted by modern humans. Their languages might even survive, contributing words and grammar structures to modern human speech. From a genetic perspective, this is extinction. The distinct Denisovan lineage ends. But from a broader perspective, it's more like merger and acquisition. The Denisovans didn't disappear so much as they became part of something larger. There's also a darker possibility we have to consider: disease. When different human populations that have been separated for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly come into contact, pathogens can jump between them with devastating effects. Modern humans leaving Africa would have carried African diseases that Denisovans had never encountered. We would have had no immunity to Asian diseases the Denisovans carried. The result could have been epidemic outbreaks that devastated both populations. But here's the critical difference. Modern humans were coming from larger, more genetically diverse populations. We could absorb the mortality from epidemic disease and bounce back. Denisovan populations, already small and scattered, might not have been able to recover. A single epidemic outbreak that killed 50% of a Denisovan population of 200 people could render that group non-viable. They'd lack the genetic diversity and population size to recover. That group would go extinct even if they survived the disease itself. Multiply that across dozens of Denisovan populations and you get a species-wide extinction event. Not because every individual died of disease, but because the diseases weakened populations enough that they couldn't maintain viable breeding networks anymore. All of these factors, climate change, competition, absorption, disease, were probably working together. This wasn't a single cause extinction. It was a convergence of multiple pressures, each one making the others worse. Climate change forcing Denisovans into smaller territories where they were more vulnerable to competition. Competition pushing them into marginal environments where they were more vulnerable to climate shocks. Disease outbreaks hitting populations that were already stressed and scattered. And underlying all of it was the fundamental vulnerability of small population sizes. The best current estimates suggest global Denisovan populations never exceeded a few 100,000 individuals spread across the entire Asian continent. Compare that to modern humans, who numbered in the millions by 40,000 years ago and were still expanding rapidly. In a direct competition between a species with millions of individuals and a species with hundreds of thousands, the outcome is mathematically predictable. The larger population has more genetic diversity, more resilience to shocks, more capacity to innovate and adapt. The smaller population is always just one bad century away from extinction. But here's what really haunts me about the Denisovan disappearance. It wasn't unique. During the same period, between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago, multiple other human species went extinct. The Neanderthals disappeared around 40,000 years ago. Homo floresiensis, the tiny hobbit humans of Indonesia, vanished around 50,000 years ago. Homo erectus, which had survived for nearly 2 million years, finally went extinct sometime in this period. One by one, every human species except Homo sapiens disappeared, and in every case, the disappearance coincided with the arrival of modern humans in their territory. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. We didn't deliberately exterminate our evolutionary cousins, probably, but our arrival consistently marked the beginning of their end. Why did we survive when they didn't? What made us different? The answer probably lies in all the small advantages adding up. Slightly better tools, slightly better organization, slightly better communication, slightly larger population sizes. None of these advantages were overwhelming on their own. In a direct confrontation, a Neanderthal or Denisovan could probably beat a modern human. But evolution doesn't care about individual confrontations. It cares about reproduction and survival across generations. And in that longer game, our small advantages compounded into dominance. By 30,000 years ago, we were alone, the only human species left on the planet, all those other lineages, all those alternative versions of humanity gone. And for 30,000 years we didn't even know they existed. We thought human history began with us, that we were the only version of humanity that ever mattered. But there's one more twist to this story. We don't actually know that the Denisovans are completely gone. The last definitive evidence is from 50,000 years ago. But the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. There are vast regions of Asia that have barely been explored archaeologically. Remote mountain valleys, isolated islands, dense forests, where a small population could potentially have survived for thousands of years longer than we think. Some researchers speculate that Denisovan populations might have persisted in isolated pockets until as recently as 15,000 years ago, maybe even later. There are stories among indigenous populations in parts of Asia about ancient people who lived in the mountains, who looked different from modern humans. Are these just myths, or are they folk memories of actual encounters with late surviving Denisovans? We don't know, and unless we find more fossils or archaeological sites from late periods, we may never know. What we do know is that somewhere between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago, the Denisovans crossed a threshold from which they couldn't return. Their populations dropped below the minimum viable size. The last breeding networks collapsed. And then there was silence. A silence that lasted 30,000 years, until a single finger bone in a Siberian cave finally told us they existed at all. Here's the thing about Denisovans. We've known about them for over a decade now, and we still have basically nothing. 3 teeth, a finger bone, a jaw fragment. That's it. That's the entire physical fossil record of a human species that lived across half of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years and interbred with our ancestors enough times that billions of people today carry their DNA. It's like trying to understand dinosaurs when all you've got is a single claw, a tooth, and maybe part of a vertebra. Except we know way more about most dinosaur species than we do about Denisovans, and that drives scientists absolutely crazy. Because every piece of genetic evidence they find just raises more questions. The search for Denisovan fossils has become one of the most intense hunts in paleoanthropology. Teams are combing through caves across Asia, re-examining collections that have been sitting in museums for decades, looking for anything that might be Denisovan. The problem is we don't actually know what we're looking for. That jaw from Baishia Karst cave showed features nobody expected. Massive molars, a distinctive shape that doesn't quite match either Neanderthals or modern humans. So how many fossils are sitting in storage right now, labelled as something else, waiting for someone to take a second look with modern genetic techniques? Some researchers think the answer might be quite a few. There are fragmentary human remains from China, Southeast Asia, even Siberia that show unusual features. Not quite modern human, not quite Neanderthal. Some of these have been given their own species names over the years: Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, various local variants. But what if some of them were actually Denisovans? What if we've been staring at Denisovan fossils for years without realizing it? The challenge is that extracting DNA from old fossils is incredibly difficult. It requires specialized labs, careful contamination control, and bones that have been preserved under exactly the right conditions. Most fossils, especially in warm, tropical regions where Denisovans seem to thrive, have no recoverable DNA at all. The proteins break down, the genetic material degrades, and you're left with mineralized bone that tells you almost nothing about who that individual was or what species they belong to. But here's where things get really interesting. Technology is changing the game completely. In the last few years, scientists have developed techniques that would have seemed like science fiction a decade ago. They can now extract ancient DNA from sediment, not from bones or teeth, but from dirt. Think about that for a second. Every time an animal or human lived in a cave, they shed skin cells, hair, left behind waste, bled from injuries. All of that contains DNA, and some of it gets preserved in the soil. For years, nobody thought it would be possible to find it, much less sequence it. But new techniques are so sensitive that they can identify species from tiny fragments of degraded genetic material mixed in with millions of years of accumulated dirt. This technology was tested at Denisova Cave, and the results were stunning. The sediment layers told a story that the fossils alone never could. Denisovans had lived in that cave not just once, but repeatedly over hundreds of thousands of years. Different populations coming and going, sometimes overlapping with Neanderthals, sometimes with modern humans. The cave had been a crossroads of human species, and the dirt remembered everything. Now researchers are taking this technique to caves across Asia, and they're finding Denisovan DNA in places nobody expected. Southeast Asian caves that showed no obvious human fossils are turning up genetic evidence of Denisovan occupation. High-altitude sites in Tibet, coastal caves in island Southeast Asia, even sites in Mongolia and northern China. Each new finding expands our understanding of where these people lived and how adaptable they really were. But the sediment DNA is also revealing something else, something that's making the whole picture even more complicated. There wasn't just one Denisovan population. There were multiple groups, genetically distinct, sometimes separated by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. The first Denisovan genome sequence from that pinky finger bone showed a population that split from Neanderthals around 400,000 years ago. But DNA from other specimens, from the jaw found in Tibet, from sediment layers in various caves, shows different genetic signatures. Some of these groups seem to have been as genetically different from each other as Neanderthals were from modern humans. which raises the uncomfortable possibility that Denisovan might not have been a single species at all, but rather a whole cluster of related species that we've lumped together because we don't have enough fossils to tell them apart. Modern human populations in Papua New Guinea and Australia carry DNA from one Denisovan group. Populations in East Asia carry DNA from a different group. Some people in Southeast Asia show genetic traces of interbreeding with yet another distinct Denisovan population. The genetic evidence suggests there might have been at least 3, maybe 4 or 5 different Denisovan species or subspecies spread across Asia, each adapted to different environments, each with their own evolutionary history. This is making researchers completely rethink the human evolutionary tree. Instead of a neat branching diagram with Neanderthals in one place, Denisovans in another, and modern humans in a third, the reality seems to have been far messier. Multiple human species and subspecies spreading across overlapping ranges, occasionally interbreeding when they're met, but mostly living separate lives in their own ecological niches. Right now, excavations are happening at dozens of sites across Asia, all hoping to be the one that finally finds a reasonably complete Denisovan skeleton. There are particularly promising caves in southern China, where researchers have found teeth and bone fragments with unusual features. There are high-altitude sites in Tibet where genetic evidence suggests substantial Denisovan populations lived for tens of thousands of years. There are caves in Laos, Vietnam, even Indonesia, where sediment DNA is turning up Denisovan traces. Each of these sites might hold the key to understanding what these people actually looked like. Because right now we're still basically guessing. The jaw suggests they were robust, with large teeth. The finger bone suggests they were big-boned, heavily built. But was that true of all Denisovan populations, or just some of them? Did the groups living at high altitude look different from the groups living in tropical forests? Were there as many physical differences between Denisovan populations as there are between modern human populations? And then there's the really big question, the one that keeps anthropologists up at night. What were Denisovans actually capable of? What was their cognitive ability? Did they have language? The archaeological evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. Stone tools found in Denisovan layers are sophisticated, but not dramatically different from those made by Neanderthals or early modern humans. There's no obvious Denisovan art, no clear evidence of symbolic behavior like the cave paintings left by modern humans or the burial practices of Neanderthals. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially when you're working with such a sparse fossil record. Some researchers argue that the genetic evidence of successful adaptation to radically different environments, from the Tibetan plateau to tropical islands, suggests sophisticated problem-solving abilities. You don't figure out how to live at 15,000 feet altitude without serious cognitive firepower. You don't build boats capable of crossing open water without abstract reasoning and planning abilities. The Denisovan DNA that helped modern humans adapt to high altitudes and island environments had to come from populations that had already solved these challenges themselves. The debate gets even more interesting when you consider language. If Denisovans and modern humans could interbreed successfully, and if those offspring were fertile enough to pass on Denisovan genes that are still present in billions of people today, that suggests they weren't just physically compatible. They had to be socially compatible too. They had to be able to communicate, form relationships, integrate into each other's groups at least occasionally. Could you do that without language? Could two human species maintain enough social connection to interbreed repeatedly over thousands of years if they couldn't actually talk to each other? Most researchers think the answer is no, which suggests Denisovans probably had language, Maybe not identical to modern human language, but sophisticated enough for complex communication. But we can't prove it. Not with 3 teeth and a finger bone. Not even with genetic evidence. Because the genes involved in language are complex and we don't fully understand how they work even in modern humans. So it remains one of the great unanswered questions. Were Denisovans as cognitively sophisticated as Neanderthals, who we know had language and symbolic thinking? Or were they somewhere in between, smart enough to survive in challenging environments but lacking the full range of modern human cognitive abilities? New technologies are starting to provide some answers. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are being applied to the Denisovan problem in fascinating ways. Researchers are feeding AI systems all the genetic data we have, along with information about modern human populations, Neanderthal genomes, and ancient climate data. The AI looks for patterns that human researchers might miss, connections between genetic variants and environmental adaptations, clues about population movements and interbreeding events. These AI analyses are suggesting things that seem almost impossible. Some models indicate there might have been Denisovan populations as far west as the Middle East, overlapping with both Neanderthals and modern humans in a zone of incredible species diversity. Other models suggest Denisovan populations survived much longer than we thought, potentially lasting until 30,000 years ago, or even more recently in isolated pockets of Southeast Asia. There are even controversial hints that some supposedly modern human fossils from Asia might actually be Denisovan modern human hybrids, individuals who had one Denisovan parent and one modern human parent, or whose ancestors had interbred multiple generations back. The genetic signatures would be subtle, but AI pattern recognition might be able to spot them in ways that traditional analysis can't. Machine learning is also being used to predict what Denisovans might have looked like based on their DNA. By comparing genetic variants associated with physical features in modern humans with the corresponding variants in Denisovan genomes, researchers are creating predictive models. These aren't perfect. They're based on limited data and lots of assumptions, but they're better than nothing. And they're suggesting that at least some Denisovan populations might have had very distinctive appearances, possibly quite different from both modern humans and Neanderthals. But all of this raises profound questions that go way beyond just understanding one extinct human species. Every new discovery about Denisovans forces us to reconsider what it means to be human. For most of history, we thought human evolution was a simple story. Linear progression from primitive ancestors to modern humans, with maybe a few failed side branches like Neanderthals along the way. Now we know the truth was far more complex. Multiple human species coexisting, competing, cooperating, interbreeding. The boundaries between species were blurry, not sharp lines. And all of these species, modern humans included, were products of the same ancient bottleneck, all carrying the genetic legacy of those 1,280 survivors who kept humanity alive through 117,000 years of near extinction. The Denisovans are teaching us that human diversity isn't a new thing. It's ancient, fundamental, woven into the very fabric of our evolution. We're not the end point of human development. We're just the current chapter in a story that included many different kinds of humans, most of whom are now gone. And that's what makes the ongoing research so important. Every new Denisovan fossil, every genome sequence, every sediment sample that reveals their presence in yet another unexpected location adds another piece to the puzzle, not just of who they were, but of who we are. Because their genes are in us, their adaptations helped us survive, their story is part of our story. Somewhere out there, probably in a cave in Asia, There's a Denisovan skull waiting to be found, a complete skeleton that will finally show us what these people actually looked like. That discovery will come eventually, and when it does, it's going to rewrite everything we thought we knew about human evolution. Again. But until then, we work with fragments, pieces of bone, strings of DNA, traces in the soil, and we keep asking questions, keep developing new technologies, keep searching for answers to mysteries that seem to multiply faster than we can solve them. Because that's what scientists do. They follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads to more questions than answers. So here we are, at the end of a story that spans hundreds of thousands of years. A story about people who lived, loved, struggled, and ultimately vanished, leaving behind only fragments of bone and traces of DNA woven into our own genomes. The Denisovans aren't just an interesting footnote in human history. They're a reminder of something we often forget in our modern world, surrounded by 8 billion people, cities stretching to the horizon, technology connecting every corner of the planet. We think of humanity as permanent, inevitable, the inevitable end point of evolution. But the Denisovans tell us something different. They remind us how fragile existence really is, how precious and temporary our time here might be. Because here's the thing, we're not the only humans who ever walk this planet, we're just the last ones still walking. For millions of years, Earth was home to multiple human species, all living simultaneously, all adapted to different environments, all developing their own cultures and technologies. Neanderthals in Europe with their robust builds and sophisticated hunting techniques, Denisovans across Asia with their high-altitude adaptations and maritime skills, Homo erectus persisting in isolated pockets, Homo floresiensis, the little hobbits of Indonesia, all of them human, all of them conscious, thinking, feeling beings with lives as complex and meaningful as our own. And now they're all gone, every single one, except us. We're the survivors of a process that eliminated every other branch of the human family tree. Some we outcompeted, some we absorbed through interbreeding, some simply faded away when their environments changed beyond their ability to adapt. But whatever the specific mechanisms, the result is the same. We're alone now in a way our ancestors never were. Yet we're not entirely alone, because every person alive today, except those with pure sub-Saharan African ancestry, carries Denisovan DNA. Small fragments, usually just 1 to 5% of our total genome, but fragments nonetheless. Real genetic sequences that once belonged to real people, living real lives in Denisova Cave or on the Tibetan Plateau or in some unnamed valley we haven't discovered yet. When modern Tibetans climb mountains that would leave others gasping for breath, they're using Denisovan genes. When Pacific Islanders dive to impossible depths, they might be drawing on Denisovan adaptations. When any of us fights off an infection using immune system genes inherited from these vanished cousins, we're quite literally surviving because they survived long enough to share their DNA with our ancestors. The Denisovans live on in us, not as a separate species but as ghosts in our genetic code, silent partners in our ongoing evolution, proof that the boundaries between human species were never as rigid as we once thought. And we're still discovering more. Every few years, new findings emerge. A jawbone in Tibet, sediment DNA from caves in Asia, refined analysis of modern genomes revealing previously unknown Denisovan populations. The story isn't over. It's still being written by researchers working in labs and excavations around the world. Who knows what we'll discover next? Maybe more Denisovan fossils that finally let us see their faces clearly. Maybe evidence of their art, their symbolic thinking, their inner lives. Maybe even more Denisovan DNA in unexpected places, revealing migration patterns and encounters we never imagined. The past isn't dead. It's not even past. It's alive in us, in our genes, in the way we adapt to high altitudes and resist diseases and process the world around us. If you've enjoyed this journey into deep human history, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a like if this story resonated with you. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from, and subscribe so you don't miss future explorations of the mysteries that make us human. Now, as you drift off to sleep, think about this. You are the product of nearly 1 million years of survival against impossible odds. You carry within you the legacy of the bottleneck survivors, the innovations of Neanderthals, the adaptations of Denisovans. You're the living embodiment of humanity's long, strange, beautiful journey through time, and that's something worth remembering.